Have you ever believed that something beyond our understanding might be living just a breath away from us, quietly watching from the shadows? In the late fall of 1987, deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a 68-year-old widower named Walter Harlow found a trembling little creature under a pine tree, something that shouldn't exist. Yet it did. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't lost. It was hiding. And what Walter didn't know was, this wasn't a random encounter. It was the beginning of a journey back into the forest, following signs that had been deliberately erased. Crushed pine needles, enormous footprints in the mud, and a quiet presence watching from behind the trees. Alongside a local schoolteacher, Mallory, who remembered her mother's words. Some forest beings speak only with their eyes. They walk deeper into the unknown. What they found was not danger, but a boundary, a line drawn between our world and theirs. By the end of that night, under birch trees and shifting moonlight, something miraculous happened. And in that moment, Walter didn't just help a lost soul find its way home. He may have found his way back to peace, for the first time since his wife passed. And if you think that's just a fairy tale, listen to this. The next morning, a bitten apple had vanished from Walter's table, and on the wall, where his wife's picture used to sit still, it had gently tilted, as if someone had just touched it. One last goodbye. Now I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? How far can this story travel? And how many hearts might it quietly touch? If this story resonated with something inside you, consider liking this video and subscribing. Together we can build a community that believes in wonder, in kindness, and maybe, just maybe, in Bigfoot, from my forest to yours. Thank you for being here. Late autumn, 1987. The sun was already giving up, hanging low behind the black pines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The light wasn't golden. It was that faded kind of silver, like the last thread of warmth tugging against the early bite of winter. Walter's boots made no sound on the leaf-packed trail. He knew it too well. For years he and Eleanor had walked this same narrow footpath through the woods, hand in hand, never in a rush. Now, only he remained, and the trail felt longer, quieter. He moved slowly, not because of age, though his knees disagreed, but because the forest felt like it was watching, not in the way of predators or ghosts, more like an old neighbor curious to see if you still remembered its name. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he thought at first it might be a bird trapped in brush. A high, wet keening. Then it rose slightly, crying, a child's crying, but not clear, not echoing like it should have. The trees swallowed it. Not muffled, swallowed, like the sound itself had weight, and the forest refused to let it pass through. Walter stopped, breath caught, not from fear, but memory. It had been 41 years since he'd heard a child cry in the woods. His son Joshua, gone in minutes during a camping trip, found safe eventually, just downriver. But those few hours, he'd never let go of the panic. And now here it was again, curling through the air like a hook in his chest. He turned off the trail without thought. The brush parted easily, as if remembering him. Dry pine needles crunched. Sap clung to the trunks in dark tears. Then he saw it. Not a child. At first, he thought it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe. But the shape was wrong. It wasn't moving right. Curled up tight beside the base of an old red pine. The bark was slick with resin. The thing was huddled so low it looked like a mound of wet leaves, except it trembled. A soft-bodied, frightened thing. Shaggy, dark fur clung to it in matted clumps. No sound came now, but he knew. That sound had come from this. Walter didn't speak, didn't even reach out. He knelt slowly, a few feet away. The thing flinched but didn't run. Its breathing was shallow. Cold sweat and earth and sap hung in the air between them. Walter gently unzipped the small canvas pouch slung over his shoulder, the same one he always carried to leave breadcrumbs or stale cornbread for the crows. From it, he pulled half a roll, a piece of sweetbread he'd baked 2 days before. Still fragrant, still soft. He set it down on a flat stone between them and backed away 1 step. He didn't coax, just waited. It took a minute, maybe longer. Then, the creature stirred. A paw? No. 2 articulate. A hand, though small, covered in fur. It inched forward, trembling, paused, sniffed. Another breath, then grabbed the bread and pulled it close, chewing now, hesitant but hungry. Then it looked at him, not with fear, not like an animal cornered or hurt, but with something quieter, raw, a look that Walter had only ever seen once, when Eleanor was dying. And her eyes told him, "Don't leave me alone in this." It was that look. "Help me, not because I am helpless, but because you're the only one who can." Walter didn't speak. He didn't move. Just let the wind fill the space. It moved through the branches with that hushed winter tone. Barely music, barely noise. The kind of wind that used to lift Eleanor's gray hair off her shoulders as she laughed. He stood finally, slowly, and turned to head back toward the cabin. He walked maybe 20 paces before he heard it. Soft steps, pine needles shifting behind him. He turned halfway. There it was, following, a little figure, no taller than his waist, covered in matted fur that glistened where it caught the dying light. 2 arms swinging low, head bowed but not in shame, more like trust. It was walking in his steps. No sound, no question. Walter didn't smile, but something softened in him. He said nothing, only turned back toward the trail and kept walking. And the small creature kept following, just behind the heel of a man who had long since given up the idea of being needed again. No words passed between them, but they had crossed something far older than language. Not a contract, not even a bond, but that aching, ancient thing humans and wild things once shared, before fear taught them to forget. And as the silver sun gave way to frost-laced dusk, the forest, witness to all things forgotten, let them pass without sound. The cabin was small, tucked beneath 2 leaning pine trees like an old secret someone forgot to keep buried. The steps creaked beneath Walter's boots, the wood swollen from years of snowmelt and moss. He didn't look back. The little one was still behind him. He could hear the soft shuffle of its feet. Not loud, just enough to remind him he wasn't alone, though part of him still questioned whether this was kindness or consequence. Inside, the warmth hit different. The iron stove had held its glow from the morning burn, a soft orange pulse. Walter tossed 2 logs in, not rushed, like he had company but not conversation. The fire woke up slow, crackling with that hungry, familiar sound, like bacon on Sunday mornings or chestnuts roasting in his grandmother's house. It was the sound of being home, the kind that sneaks into your bones before you realize how cold you'd become. The little one hesitated at the doorway, its fur catching the low afternoon light. Walter didn't speak. He just reached for the kettle, filled it halfway with water, and set it on the stove. Then, he took the old folded flannel blanket from the bench and laid it near the hearth without words. It was enough. The creature stepped in, slow, cautious, but not afraid. Not anymore. Its fur was matted with dried sap and dust. Pine needles clung to its knees. Walter filled a bowl with warm water, just warm, not hot, and grabbed a clean rag from the drawer beneath the sink. He moved like he was tending to a bird with a broken wing, quiet, gentle, like he'd done this before. Maybe not for a creature like this, but for something fragile all the same. He knelt. The floor moaned beneath his knees. He didn't touch it yet, just showed the bowl, showed the cloth, waited. The creature looked at him, then the water, then back. It didn't flinch when he reached out. He dabbed at the mud on its ankles first, rinsing with steady hands. Then its feet, small, calloused, the pads cracked but strong. It didn't speak. Not a sound. But its breathing slowed. And when Walter finished, the creature pulled its knees to its chest and sat on the flannel, eyes wide but soft, scanning the room the way children scan a place they know they'll never quite belong to, but wish they could. The smell of meat lard and caramelized onions still lingered from lunch. Walter reached for the skillet, still warm, and cracked 2 eggs. No butter, just let them sizzle in the fat. He toasted 2 slices of bread on the burner's edge, watching the crust bubble, the edges crisp. He placed the plate down, close enough for the little one to smell, but far enough to let it choose. It didn't need coaxing. The eggs vanished first, then the bread. But even while eating, its eyes kept darting, not around the room, but toward the door, toward the woods, like something out there might come knocking, or worse, might not. Walter moved to the far wall. A framed photo hung crooked there, swaying slightly where the draft caught it. He straightened it carefully. Oak frame. Simple. The photo inside was of Eleanor, standing in that exact spot 20 years ago, her hand resting on the same windowsill, her eyes caught in some thought just beyond the glass. He placed the photo back where she liked it, just right of the stove, above the small bookshelf. The wood creaked like it remembered her. Dust floated in the beam of late sun like memories unshaken. The creature stood, its gaze fixed on the frame. It stepped closer, touched the edge of the glass with one knuckle, then pulled back like the memory inside might burn. Walter didn't move. It looked at him, then back at the photo, then toward the forest, as if it understood what the picture meant, as if it too had someone it missed, someone who never came back. Evening came in shades, not all at once, but in slices. First through the west window, where the light turned the dust golden, then across the floor where the shadows lengthened like stretched-out hands. Walter lit the oil lamp. Its glow was soft, amber, not enough to banish the dark, but just enough to keep it company. Outside, the wind had died. No rustling, no owls. Just the silence that comes when something big is near, something that doesn't want to be heard. Then it happened, just past the window, no more than 3 feet away. A shadow moved. Slow, tall, taller than any man Walter had ever seen. It didn't pause, didn't look inside, just walked by. The shape passed like smoke between trees, soundless, as if the woods had let it slip through without breaking a single branch. Walter didn't reach for the rifle, didn't shout. He just stood still, breath caught somewhere deep. The creature by the fire didn't tremble. It turned its head slowly and watched, eyes fixed on the space just beyond the glass, then looked back at Walter. They both knew. If he told anyone, if he called the sheriff or the ranger or even his cousin Roy down at the logging mill, whatever this was, it would be gone. The woods would close up. The silence would grow teeth. And something ancient, something that had trusted him enough to follow him home, would vanish forever. The fire popped. One ember skipped out and died on the hearth. The little one blinked, slow and heavy, then leaned its head against the bench leg, eyes still fixed on the door. Walter watched it breathe. There was no plan, no decision made, but somewhere between the quiet knock of firewood shifting and the oil lamp's breathy flicker, Walter understood. This wasn't just a visitor. This wasn't just a stray. This was a question. And he, tired, widowed, heart-heavy, was the only one the forest had chosen to answer it. He pulled the blanket over its shoulders. Not tight. Just enough. The kind of way a father might, even if he'd forgotten how. Outside, the moon climbed slow and cautious, and inside, 2 heartbeats remained, one old, one unknown, both learning what it meant to stay, not because they were safe, but because, in that moment, they were not alone. And in a cabin too small for anything loud, silence became the loudest promise they could keep. The morning didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with a hush, A cold quiet settled into every pine needle and stone like the forest had braced itself overnight. Walter woke before the frost gave way, rubbing his joints at the table where the wood still held the memory of last night's fire. He didn't speak, didn't write a note, just dressed in layers and packed his canteen. The cabin didn't ask questions, and neither did the creature curled beside the hearth. The little one had slept facing the door, not in fear, but in instinct. They set off before full light, the trees still ghosting gray in the mist. Grace had offered to come later, but Walter knew this morning belonged to something quieter, something that didn't need a witness just yet. The kind of thing a man had to do when he'd been chosen, not when he volunteered. The forest greeted them the way it always had, without ceremony. Just a slow, steady inhale. Pine sap, wet dirt, the crisp snap of moss under boot. Walter walked ahead, steady but not rushed, while the little one followed close behind, always watching, always listening. They didn't go down the usual trails. They didn't need to. The little one led, not by pointing, but by looking. Long, still glances into the brush, head tilting slightly as if remembering something not with thought, but with bone. Walter paid attention to the direction it stared, to the places it hesitated, to the places where the silence grew louder. Deeper in, the air changed, less light, less warmth. The sun tried, but the trees swallowed it. The ground grew uneven, roots reaching like fingers through the soil. Some places, you could almost feel the earth bend slightly beneath your weight, like it remembered other footsteps before yours. That's where they found it. A trail, thin, like a game path, but blocked. Not by nature. Someone had laid fallen branches across it, like a line drawn to divert. Not enough to stop an animal, but enough to mislead a man. Walter knelt, touched the bark. Clean break, fresh, not windfall, not chance. Someone didn't want this trail followed. He looked at the little one. It stared forward, past the blockage, not blinking. It knew. Walter cleared a path without saying a word. 20 yards in, they found the signs. It was subtle at first. Only a sharp-angled branch bent at a precise angle, not broken. Just pinned back against the pine by another, twisted carefully into a downward loop. Walter wouldn't have seen it. Not if he weren't looking through the little one's eyes now. But there it was, 7 feet high, a pine needle arrow, pointing back or maybe up. It was hard to say, but it wasn't natural. Walter stepped back, scanning the canopy. There, another one, higher, bent the same way, facing a different direction. He exhaled slow. There was language here. Not words, but marks, signs. This wasn't navigation. This was warning. A pattern meant for those who understood something older than compass or clock. They moved on. Further in, the forest began to fold. Not close, not claustrophobic, but deliberate. The trees leaned, their placement more rhythmic. Walter didn't feel lost. He felt led. That's when the ground changed. The brush softened, became marshy. Not deep, but enough to leave behind impressions. Walter paused as his boot stuck slightly, suction holding tight for a moment before releasing with a pop. He looked down. A print, not his. Not boot. A wide, flat impression, nearly as long as his forearm. He crouched slowly. The print had toes. 5. Spread wide, deep heel. The weight had sunk it several inches below the surface. Older than fresh, but not by much. Still defined enough to speak. Walter looked beside it. Another print, smaller, same shape, lighter step. It overlapped. The little one stepped close, almost beside him now. It didn't react with surprise, just stillness. Walter followed its eyes. Further ahead, the ground rose gently. No prints there, but the trees opened slightly in a clearing he hadn't noticed. Not full daylight, but enough to see clearly. No movement, but something had stood here. Walter didn't speak. He knew. This was where they'd been. Not a place of passing. A place of pause. The way the air held still, the way the birds avoided it. This was where a family had stood once, and maybe mourned, maybe waited. He stepped back, heart tight. He didn't call out, didn't dare. To speak here would be like cutting into sacred stone. They turned around only when the little one looked away. Back through the brush, retracing steps not meant to be tread twice. Walter felt the weight now. He understood. This wasn't just about finding a place. This was about time. Something had changed. By the time they reached the cabin again, the sun was higher, but the chill had not lifted. The little one climbed the porch steps last. It didn't look back. It didn't need to. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat beside the cold stove, hand resting on the side of the chair where Eleanor used to place hers. The little one slept again near the hearth, curled in the same posture. The braid of grass still hung by the door. The photograph hadn't moved. Walter stared at the wall. He wasn't afraid. But he understood something now he hadn't before. This creature, this child, could not stay. Not because of danger, but because some spirits do not belong inside walls. Even the ones built with love. And somewhere out there, in a bend of trail meant not to be found again, a family had once waited, and maybe still did. And he would not be the man who taught it to forget how to return. The flame hadn't gone out. It had only grown quieter. And when dawn came, it came slow. Like the forest was giving him one more chance to listen. And this time, he would. There was a rhythm to remote living. You didn't need a clock when the trees told you time by the way the light moved across the porch or how the chill settled heavier by late afternoon. Walter had lived by that rhythm longer than most folks had kept marriages. And today, something in that rhythm hesitated. It was the wind, or the lack of it. The way the birds hadn't called since breakfast. The way the forest seemed to lean in, just a bit closer to the cabin walls. The little one had stayed quiet all morning. Not in fear, but in some kind of watchfulness. Like it was waiting for something to appear. When the knock came, it wasn't loud. Just 2 soft taps, a pause, then one more. Almost polite. Walter opened the door slowly, not out of caution, but because part of him didn't want to break whatever spell was holding the moment in place. She stood there, cheeks pink from the late October chill, a basket looped over one arm, steam still rising from beneath the checkered cloth. Grace Mallory, 27, hair tucked into a gray wool cap, boots dusted with pine needles. She smiled like someone who was trying to balance 2 things at once, concern and respect. Not pity. Never that. "I brought pie," she said, lifting the basket slightly. "Town's been wondering if you ran out of flour or just got tired of seeing people." Walter stepped back without answering. He knew Grace wasn't the kind to waste words. That's why he liked her. She had her mother's honesty and her father's quiet strength, both folded into something soft-spoken and observant. She didn't fill silence unless it needed filling. Inside, the cabin had the thick warmth of wood heat and leftover eggs. Grace stepped in, letting the door fall shut behind her with a muted thump. The smell of apples and cinnamon rose from the basket as she set it on the counter. Then she saw it. She didn't gasp, didn't flinch, just looked. The little one was crouched beside the table, half-shadowed by the low-hanging checkered tablecloth, its fur still dull from the night before, but eyes bright and fixed on her with unblinking intensity. Grace held her ground. One heartbeat, then another. Then she said quietly, not to Walter but to the thing itself, "You don't have to hide. I won't hurt you." The little one didn't move. Grace didn't press. She turned to Walter instead. "You feeding it?" He nodded. "You think it's, what, lost?" He shook his head once. "I think it's looking." "For what?" "Not what, who." Grace looked again. The little one had shifted slightly, inching back under the table, not afraid but cautious, like it had seen humans before and had learned to be patient with them. "My mother used to say," Grace began, "that there are creatures in the woods who don't talk with mouths but with their eyes. Said if you ever met one, you'd know by the way they looked at you. like they'd already weighed your soul and decided if you were worth trusting. She didn't smile as she said it. It wasn't a story. It was memory. Walter moved to the wood box, tossing another log onto the embers. Sparks fluttered upward, soft, dancing. The light flickered across the cabin walls, throwing shadows that moved like old thoughts. Grace leaned against the counter. "Town's talking," she said finally. "I know. They said you haven't come in since Tuesday. Said you skipped the supply run. That ain't like you." Walter didn't answer. "You know how people are," she continued. "Curious doesn't always mean kind." He looked at her then. Really looked. His face was lined, deeper than last fall. His eyes, clear, sharp, but tired in that way people get when they've been holding a secret heavier than grief. Grace lowered her voice. "If this gets out, they'll come. You know that. They'll poke, they'll chase, they'll break whatever this is." "I know," he said, softer than breath. "So what's the plan?" He didn't have one. Not yet. Grace took a slow step forward. "You know this isn't about you anymore. Not just you." He looked down. She pressed gently. "We have to find its people, before someone else finds it and decides it doesn't deserve to have any." The words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy, bitter. Outside, a crow called once, sharp, urgent, and was gone. The little one was still watching. Its eyes weren't afraid. But they weren't resting either. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a small knit square. Red wool, faded with age. She unfolded it slowly, fingers tracing the worn corners. "My mom knitted this," she said. "Always kept it in her coat. Said the forest listened better when it knew you carried something from someone who loved you." She walked toward the table, slow, deliberate. Not crouching, not shrinking herself, just walking like a person who understood fear but didn't serve it. She set the knit square on the floor, a foot or so from the edge of the tablecloth. The little one looked at it, then at her, then back at Walter. It didn't take the cloth, but it didn't back away either. Grace stood up and turned back to Walter. "That's the best offer I can make." He nodded. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the latch, then said without turning, "If you wait too long, you won't be the only one in the woods looking." He didn't answer. But something shifted in his chest. Not panic, not quite, but urgency. By the time the door swung shut behind her, the sun had slipped below the ridge. The fire hissed as another log caught. And Walter, standing in the quiet, knew she was right. This was no longer a question of hiding something. This was a matter of returning something that never should have been alone in the first place. Later, long after the kettle had cooled and the embers died to soft red breath, Walter looked at the little one curled near the hearth. Its chest rose and fell in that twitchy, dreaming rhythm of creatures not fully asleep. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the damp needles. The moon was rising, thin and pale, like bone behind gauze. The woods didn't move, but they listened. He spoke aloud just once. "I'll take it back." No answer, but something in the darkness seemed to ease. Back inside, the cabin felt smaller. Not cramped, just full. Of choice, of weight, of promise. He didn't know how far they'd have to go. Didn't know who or what they'd find. But the time for waiting had passed, and somewhere out there someone might be missing something they loved. That was all the reason he needed. And the woods, old and wide and watching, held its breath once more. The forest didn't wake with birdsong that morning. It breathed in low tones, the kind only the old pines understood. Fog clung to the underbrush, thin as memory, casting a hush over everything like a held breath that hadn't quite been released. Walter stood outside the cabin before sunrise, adjusting the leather strap on his canteen like he had somewhere to be. The kettle had been left cold. The fire, just embers. There would be no breakfast, just motion. The little one was already waiting near the woodpile, crouched low, head tilted as though listening to something far away. Grace came down the trail from her truck with her satchel slung across her chest, boots damp with morning dew. She didn't ask if they were ready. She could see it in the way Walter stood, shoulders set, jaw firm, eyes scanning the distance like he was searching for a door in the trees. They didn't speak much as they set off. Words would have only made things heavier. Instead, it was the rustle of coats brushing against ferns, the soft suck of boots pulling free from damp soil, the slow breathing of three beings who had agreed, silently, to go where maps ran out. The forest thickened quickly once they left the trail behind. Daylight filtered through like it was bleeding in from somewhere far off, cut into ribbons by the skeletal arms of birch and pine. The ground softened underfoot, and tree roots rose like veins beneath the skin of the earth, knotting their path into something that had to be stepped over with intention. Grace kept to Walter's right. The little one didn't follow behind, but moved beside them, like it belonged there. Walter noticed it first, the slight shift in the trees, the way the ground curved subtly to the left without reason. He remembered this from his younger days when he'd tracked elk through similar terrain. The forest sometimes bent itself to guide you or push you back. They came across a narrow path veiled in deadfall and wind-blown brush, too neatly obstructed to be natural. Someone had covered the trail on purpose, someone who didn't want to be followed. The little one paused, sniffed the air, then looked toward the canopy. Not the sky, but something higher than they could reach. Walter followed the gaze. Above them, pinned carefully between the higher branches of a fir, was a broken cluster of pine needles, bent in one precise direction. An arrow, not carved, not human, but unmistakable. 7 feet high, maybe more. Deliberate. They kept moving. An hour later, the sun had found its strength, but down here, the forest still drank most of it. They crossed through a gully where the mud was thick and slick. Walter nearly slipped once, but the little one grabbed his coat and steadied him, not with panic, but with the casual quickness of someone used to guiding others. As they rose from the dip, Grace spotted it first. A patch of black mud, half-dried, still holding the imprint of something massive. At first glance, it looked like a bear's track, but longer, wider, and deeper. Next to it, almost on top, was a smaller print, fresher. Not a boot, not a hoof. It was shaped like the little one's. Walter crouched beside it, heart thumping in his ears. The prints overlapped, not in conflict, but in sequence. One being had walked here before. The other had followed. "This is it," Walter said, almost a whisper. Grace scanned the trees. Her hand rested on the pouch tied to her belt. Not for a weapon, but for the small compass she hadn't used once on this trip. She trusted the forest to say more than magnets. "They were together," she murmured. "This is where they passed through," but something tugged at Walter's gut. The mud should have been drier here, the imprint too recent. Either the ones they were following had circled back, or they weren't alone out here. The little one's posture had changed too. It wasn't afraid, but alert. They moved on, quieter now, the kind of quiet that doesn't break twigs. They came to a fallen log, thick with rot and velvet moss. It should have been just another obstacle, but Grace pointed. Across the top were 3 pine cones, not scattered, laid in a line, equal space between, like a fence, like a warning. The little one didn't cross. Neither did Walter. "Boundary," he muttered. Grace looked around. "Why here?" No one answered, but everyone felt it. Beyond the log, the woods changed. The light shifted colder, less green. The sounds, the ones they'd been walking with all morning, had faded. No birds, no insects, just the groan of old branches and the breath of something unseen. Even the wind, which had carried the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, now smelled different. It wasn't rot, it wasn't animal, it was old. Not far ahead, the trail narrowed. Not from trees, but from intention. Vines arched inward, curving as though trained to grow that way. The air thickened. Grace placed her hand gently on Walter's arm and stopped. "Look," she whispered. To the left of the path, half hidden behind a wide maple, a second set of prints. These were sharper, deeper, and not the same shape as before. Broader, heavier, spaced farther apart. Whatever made them had weight and height well beyond the little one's kind. Walter's breath caught. "That's not them," he said. Grace looked at the little one. It was still, unmoving. Then slowly it raised one arm and pointed, not to the tracks, but past them, at a wide oak tree just beyond the clearing. There, stepping through the filtered shafts of weak sunlight, was a silhouette. It moved slow, not with stealth, but with confidence. Too tall, too upright. Its face couldn't be seen, but the shape, broad shoulders, elongated limbs, arms swaying just a bit too long, told Walter everything he needed to know. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't curious. It was passing through, acknowledging them, and nothing more. Grace's breath had caught halfway up her throat. Her fingers clutched the edge of her scarf like she was bracing herself against the cold. The little one didn't move. Neither did Walter. The figure paused, turned its head, didn't step closer, didn't raise its arms. Just stood there, like a sentry. Then, without a sound, it turned back and disappeared behind the trees. The forest closed again, but this time, it hadn't shut them out. It had let them in, just enough. Walter exhaled. Grace spoke finally. "That wasn't a warning." "No," Walter agreed. "That was a message." "What did it say?" "They know we're here." Grace's voice dropped. "And?" Walter looked at the little one, who had stepped forward now, a little closer to the spot where the figure had been, but still keeping distance. He looked back toward Grace. "They don't want to stop us, but they don't want us going further either." They stood like that for a long minute, just listening. Walter reached for the canteen, took a sip, and offered it to the little one. It drank. The wind picked up then, just slightly, enough to rustle the treetops but not stir the ground. And in that hush, in the soft shifting of leaves and the breathless pause of all things, something was understood without words. Whatever waited ahead wasn't simply reunion, it was decision. And the forest, which had led them this far, would no longer guide blindly. From here forward, they would have to choose every step. The path was open, but the welcome was not promised. And as they moved forward, deeper into that place where sun barely kissed the soil, the trees began to grow thicker again, like something watching, like something weighing, like something waiting to see if they truly meant to finish what they'd begun. By the time they reached the ravine, night had already started to pull the world inward. The trees grew taller, their spines twisting into the darkness like pillars of a broken cathedral. The light was gone from the sky, but it hadn't turned black yet. Just that deep slate gray that settles over the forest before the stars dare show themselves. The air was changing too. Heavier, damp with something that didn't smell quite like rain. It was older than that. Like wet bark and stone and time itself loosening from the roots. They made camp without speaking. Grace laid her scarf down first on a dry patch beneath a grove of leaning birches. Walter collected twigs, dry moss, and peeled bark the way he'd done for decades. It took 3 tries before the flame caught, crackling low and orange in the shallow pit. The little one sat with its legs tucked beneath it, eyes reflecting the fire, but never staring too long. It was watching the woods again, watching something Walter couldn't see. No one unpacked much. No food, no chatter. They knew they were closer now. The way the forest felt thinner and thicker all at once, like the skin of the earth was wearing thin and something pulsing underneath was beginning to push upward. Walter added another log. "We shouldn't stay long," he said, voice low. Grace didn't argue. She just pulled her knees up to her chest and let the silence keep them company. Then the wind changed. Not a gust, just a breath, barely there. But it brought with it a new scent. Not wood smoke, not the sweetness of decaying leaves, but something sharper, fainter, the acrid trace of distant fire. A campfire, maybe, or something older, less human. It was far, but not far enough. Grace stood up slowly, eyes scanning the ridgeline. "That smoke's not ours." Walter stood too. Could be hunters. No fire permits out this way this time of year. Then it's someone who doesn't care about permits. They didn't speak the next thought out loud. If someone else was out here, this deep, this quiet, then they weren't just camping. They were looking. The little one rose, not startled, but steady. Its back straightened. Its ears twitched. It didn't growl. It didn't flee. It simply walked to the edge of camp and stared into the birches, just beyond the light of the fire. Walter stepped beside it, laid a hand gently on its shoulder. Then everything stopped. A sound, a step. Not on leaves, not twigs, but snow. Crunch. Then another. They turned as one. On the far side of the grove, just beyond the tangled roots of two fallen trees, stood a figure. Tall. Not just tall, big. It didn't move. Not forward. Not back. Just stood there, half caught in the dim moonlight bleeding through the canopy. Its breath was visible, clouds of steam rising slow and steady from a body built like it had grown from the earth itself. Grace reached for her scarf, squeezing the wool like it could anchor her. Walter didn't blink. The little one stepped forward. No hesitation. It walked across the clearing, past the fire, past Walter's outstretched arm, straight toward the figure. Its small frame disappeared for a moment behind the tangled trunks, then emerged into the half-glow of the clearing's far edge. No words were said. None were needed. The larger figure knelt, not in a bow, not in submission, but with the stillness of something that had waited too long to kneel quickly. It extended one arm, fur thick and silver at the tips, fingers wide, human-shaped but wild in proportion. The little one stepped into the space between them. No cry, no run. Just a reaching gesture, soft, slow, like a memory returning home. Their foreheads touched. Grace felt something break in her chest. Not a sob, not fear, but release. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her scarf, breath catching halfway through a word she couldn't form. The fire crackled once, then again. The big figure shifted. It turned its head toward Walter. Their eyes locked across the firelight. No hatred, no distrust, but wait, recognition, and something else. The large creature reached into a pouch made of twisted bark and grass, tied with a strand of braided vine. From it, it pulled something small, round, made of woven stems, tight and perfect. A loop, no wider than a woman's wrist. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and held it out to Grace. She didn't move at first. Walter touched her arm. "You should take it," he whispered. She stepped forward, boots soft against the moss, hand shaking slightly as she reached for the gift. The woven circle was warm, still smelled faintly of earth and crushed mint. As she took it, the large figure let its hand rest a moment longer, then pulled away. The little one turned back, looked at Walter. Its expression had changed, not in shape, but in depth. A tiny hand touched its chest, right over the heart. Then it extended that hand outward, slow, deliberate, the way Walter had once done without thinking, pressing palm to chest during one of those moments words couldn't hold. It was mimicking him. No, mirroring him. Walter couldn't speak. Not yet. He nodded barely. The little one's eyes lingered on him a second longer, then turned and followed the larger figure into the trees. No sound of leaves, no broken branches. They were simply absorbed, like shadows rejoining the night. The grove felt emptier, but not hollow. Grace turned the woven loop in her fingers. "I think that meant something," she said softly. Walter didn't answer. He looked up instead. The stars had finally come out. Scattered, faint, but watching. And above the highest branch of the birch, a full moon sat like a quiet witness. They didn't rebuild the fire. They didn't need to. The cold didn't feel sharp anymore, just real. And Walter, for the first time in years, laid back against his pack, eyes open, breath steady, and slept without dreams. Walter returned to the cabin just after sunrise, his boots dragging a thin line of forest mud across the front steps that he didn't bother wiping away. The door creaked open the same way it always had, like it sighed each time someone left and hoped they'd come back changed. His pack fell beside the old chair with a heavy thud. It had carried no more than a spare thermos and a tin of matches on the way out, and even less on the way back. Yet it felt heavier, not from weight, but from the air around him. The cabin hadn't changed in their absence. The stove still held a faint ghost of the last fire. The woodpile beside the hearth remained neatly stacked, half covered with a wool blanket. The kettle sat on the shelf, untouched. Nothing broken, nothing stolen. But Walter could feel it the moment he stepped inside. Something had moved through here. Something with care. The kind of movement that doesn't disturb things, just gently nudges them enough to say, "I was here." He stepped further in, paused. There was a smell. Not foul, not foreign, just living, earth, sap. A faint trace of dried pine. Not his. He noticed the photograph first. The frame had shifted, just a hair, tilted left by the smallest of angles. It had been level when he left. Eleanor always made sure of that. She used to line it up with the seam between the wall panels. "If I can see it's crooked, the spirits can too," she'd say with that half-smile she saved for when she wasn't joking. Walter leaned in. The nail hadn't loosened. No draft could have knocked it. Someone had touched it, and left it that way. He didn't fix it. Instead, he looked to the table. One apple was gone. Not rolled to the floor, not shriveled, just gone. The others in the bowl sat untouched, their skins still taut with that late fall shine. Walter hadn't eaten any since before the trip, and Grace didn't like red apples. The back door creaked softly behind him. He turned, not startled, just aware. The door was closed, but the latch hung loose. It hadn't been properly hooked. He stepped over, ran a thumb along the worn edge of the frame. Then he saw it. Hanging from the wooden peg near the door frame was a thin braid of grass, woven so fine it looked like thread. A pattern so tight, it must have taken delicate fingers, or the memory of them. It was tied into a loop, perfectly round, no decoration, no flourish, just quiet intention. Walter stared at it, eyes tracing each fold, each tuck, each place where the blades of grass overlapped like the weaving had meaning. He didn't touch it. It swayed slightly in the still air. He closed the door gently, this time hooking the latch with care, then turned and stood in the center of the cabin, letting silence press in around him. He wasn't afraid, not even close. He was being watched, not from malice, but from closeness. Like someone was checking in on him, like someone remembered he existed and wanted him to know. He sat down. No fire, no radio, just the sound of wind brushing past the eaves like fingertips on glass. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for conversation. It just sits with you. That afternoon, Grace returned to town. Her hands were stiff from the cold, and she hadn't spoken much since they'd left the forest's edge. She kept replaying the same 3 seconds in her mind, the moment the little one turned back, the way its fingers touched its chest, that looked like a goodbye carved into time. Not final, but real. The truck hummed under her boots as she drove down the long dirt road past the rusted mailbox where the number had faded so long ago. It might as well have never existed. She parked by her mother's porch. The house had the same creak as Walter's cabin, only louder, older, like it knew things but wouldn't say them out loud. Grace moved through the hallway without turning on the lights. She didn't need to see. She knew where everything was. The scuff on the floorboard near the pantry. The photo of her grandfather still hung crooked above the coat hook. The shelf by the bedroom window where the journals stayed. Her mother's journals. She knelt, brushing dust away from the spines with the edge of her scarf. The one she'd worn when the little one was returned. Still smelled like bark and fire and something older than either. She pulled the second-to-last notebook from the stack and flipped through gently. Pages of script in her mother's small, sharp handwriting, tight and steady, filling line after line with stories and warnings and questions no one had ever answered. Then she found it. A passage near the back. No date, just a line underlined twice. "They don't speak like we do, but they remember. They wait. They return what is owed." Beneath it, barely legible. If you ever meet one, listen. Not with your ears, with your heart. They won't ask. They'll show you what's missing. Grace closed the journal, pressing her hand flat on the cover like it might hold warmth still. She didn't cry, but something inside her settled, like the dust that falls once a room finally exhales. That night, Walter didn't light the oil lamp. He let the moon do the work. It slipped in through the window pane, catching the curve of the woven grass charm, making its shadow stretch across the wall in a perfect circle. The photograph of Eleanor caught the light too. Her smile, forever paused in that frozen frame, now seemed softer, closer. He didn't say anything, didn't have to, because for the first time in a very long time, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt watched. It felt known, not by people, but by presence, the kind that lingers in pine needles, in old bark, in the warmth left behind when a hand rests on your shoulder a moment longer than needed. Walter went to sleep that night without bolting the door. He didn't need to. The forest knew the way in, and someone out there, someone small, someone wild, had left a promise on his wall. He was not forgotten, and as the night folded over the ridge like a worn quilt, somewhere in the dark, something breathed, steady, just watching, just waiting. Not to take, but to remember. The snow had long melted from the ground by the time the light returned in full. Spring didn't come easy in the Upper Peninsula. It clawed its way out of the frost, slow and cautious, like a bear waking from a long winter. By March, the ice had cracked in thin veins along the edges of the lake. The earth was soft underfoot, still holding water from months of freeze. And in the woods, the pine needles glistened, not with snow, but with sun. Walter had grown slower. He moved like someone listening to his bones before every step. His hair, once a soft salt, had turned near white now, full and wind-tangled, falling below the collar of his flannel shirt that had faded from red to a memory of it. He didn't complain. Not once. That wasn't his nature. He just took things slower, more deliberate, like each motion had to count because there were only so many left. He sat most mornings on the small bench just outside the cabin door, not to watch anything in particular, just to sit. The trees had become companions more than scenery. The air didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt shared, like there were still things around him breathing, waiting, remembering. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew. Something had shifted after that night in the woods, after the fire, after the braid of grass left by the door. He was being watched, not in fear, not in warning, but in care. It was a foggy afternoon when it happened, the kind where sunlight thins out behind a veil of damp silver, and you don't realize the hour because everything looks suspended, like time standing still, just for a while. Walter had made tea, not coffee anymore. It hurt his stomach these days. The kettle hissed gently, and the scent of chamomile rose into the beams above the hearth. He poured slowly, hands steady despite the cold. Then he felt it, that shift in air pressure, the way the silence curved inward. He stepped outside. Didn't grab a coat, didn't need to. The light stretched long across the clearing, and there, at the edge of the pines, standing still in the very spot where months ago Walter had first heard that buried, half-swallowed cry, stood a figure. Not tall, not yet, just 4 feet, maybe a bit more now. Shoulders straighter, fur darker, thicker, but unmistakable. The little one had returned, but it wasn't little anymore. It didn't move right away. It stood at the base of the same pine, hands at its sides, head tilted slightly. Not in confusion, in memory. Walter didn't speak. He couldn't have. His throat had closed on him the moment he saw it. They watched each other across the space between. A patch of muddy grass, some fresh needles, a few broken twigs. Then the figure stepped forward, 1 foot, then another. Each step light, deliberate, no fear, no urgency. It didn't come all the way to the cabin. It stopped a few yards short, right near the spot where Walter always rested his back after long walks. The worn plank along the porch still bearing the curve of his spine. The creature reached out, not fast, Not rehearsed. It pressed one hand flat against that wooden siding, just held it there, then closed its eyes. Walter still hadn't moved, not out of shock, not even hesitation. He just didn't want to interrupt whatever this was. After a while, the creature opened its eyes and looked at him. There was no mimicry this time, no copying of gestures, just clarity. The kind that comes when you've crossed through enough seasons to understand why some things break and others stay. Walter finally stepped forward. Slow, steady, not to close the gap, not to reach, just to be present in the same space. His breath was loud in his ears, but not heavy. The creature watched him, then gave a slight nod. A farewell? No, not that. An acknowledgement of a promise kept, of something mended. Then, just as it had come, it turned and walked back toward the tree line. Didn't run, didn't vanish, just walked, until the mist took it. Walter didn't follow. He leaned gently against the porch wall where the handprint had been. The wood still warm. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since Eleanor had passed, he let his whole body rest against the world without bracing. That night he slept with the window open. The wind smelled like thawed moss and cold pine, and sleep came not in fragments, but in a deep, endless drift. Grace, years later, sat at the same desk where her mother had once written stories that sounded like fairy tales, but weren't. She was older now, lines around the eyes, hair pulled back tighter, but her hands still moved with the same quiet intention as they flipped through her mother's last notebook. One entry at the bottom, almost forgotten, caught her eye. A single sentence. Don't fear the forest. Fear the hearts that have forgotten how to love. She traced it with one finger. Outside, dusk was folding over the hills again. Another season was turning. And somewhere in the thicket of trees beyond Walter's old cabin, under the same silver light, among the same quiet roots, something was walking softly. Not to hide, but to remember. Sometimes the forest gives no explanation. It doesn't raise its voice or send signs that make sense to the world outside the trees. What it offers instead is presence. A stillness that sees you, a silence that listens back. And if you're patient, if your heart is quiet enough, you might realize you were never walking alone. This story was never really about what hides in the woods. Not truly. It's about what waits in us. The part that aches for connection without needing words. The part that knows kindness, even when it's wordless and wild and unfamiliar. The part that chooses compassion over control. That says, I don't understand you, but I will not fear you. We live in a world that moves too fast, where people forget to look up, where everything needs to be proven, measured, explained. But some things are meant to be felt, not solved. Some truths live in glances, in gestures, in moments that don't need an audience to matter. And maybe the most sacred bonds aren't made of blood or language or law. Maybe they're made of care, of returning, of staying. Because what matters most, in the end, isn't what you've seen. It's what you've protected, what you've kept safe, even when no one else would have. This was a story about the quiet kind of courage. The kind that doesn't make headlines, that doesn't ask to be remembered, but changes everything anyway. It lives in the way we show up for one another, creature to creature, soul to soul, especially when the world tells us not to. So wherever you are, however far from the woods you may feel, remember this: compassion is never wasted, kindness leaves a trail, and love, real, deep, wordless love, is the kind of thing that always finds its way home. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you feel seen, or reminded you of something you thought you'd forgotten, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your heart. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. And if you'd like to be part of more journeys like this one, stories where the forest watches and love whispers in unlikely places, please consider subscribing and joining our community. It means more than you know. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.